Hello everyone, this is Jeff with Mississippi and the Civil War. I know you were expecting to see the episode on civilians during the war today, but unfortunately I have had a few technical issues. In fact, my thumb drive that had all of my notes and my illustrations for the episode decided to die, and die catastrophically, and I can't recover any of the information. Fortunately, I do have a backup, but it is sitting on my desk at work and I cannot get to it today. And as they say, the show must go on, so I have put together an alternate episode for the July 4th holiday. And I decided, since I couldn't do Vicksburg, I would do the other big July battle, Gettysburg. And this is based on an article I did some years ago on casualties in the 21st Mississippi Infantry, which was part of Barksdale's brigade that saw some extremely heavy fighting in the peach orchard at Gettysburg. And I've been interested in this unit for quite a long time. I worked at the Old Courthouse Museum in Vicksburg. Vicksburg supplied two companies to the regiment, and so I spent a lot of time around the battle flag of the 21st Mississippi. I read the letters and diaries and reminiscences of men in the 21st, so I've had a very active interest in this unit for a long time. So I've been working on a regimental history of the 21st, so I've gone through their service records and have compiled some pretty accurate casualty lists for the battles that they participated in. And Gettysburg was among the worst of the dozen major battles they were in. But so don't worry, the episode on civilians will be coming up very shortly. I just got to grab my backup and get it ready to go. It should be coming out later this week. Again, I apologize for the technical difficulties, but you know, these things happen. But I'll just do the best I can and keep going. So today's episode is called "They Dared to Go Where Duty Called: Casualties of the 21st Mississippi Infantry at Gettysburg." And in October 1886, the Clarion Ledger published a letter written by Colonel W.D. Holder, the former commander of the 17th Mississippi Infantry that served alongside the 21st in Barksdale's brigade. And he was writing to John S. McNeely, who had served as a private in the 21st Mississippi Infantry. Holder spoke in this letter about the Battle of Gettysburg in particular and the part played by Barksdale's Mississippi Brigade. Holder wrote with admiration about his old brigade, saying, quote, "Barksdale's brigade in the line of battle on the day in question stood thus: extreme left 13th Mississippi Regiment, Colonel Carter; 17th, Colonel Holder; 18th, Colonel Griffin; 21st, Colonel Humphreys. Colonel Griffin was wounded in the leg, Colonel Carter killed on the field, and General Barksdale fell in the midst of his gallant old 13th Regiment. He always gravitated to his beloved regiment in every battle. I regret that I cannot name the color bearer who signalized himself at the Trossel House. No color bearer of that gallant brigade, however, could be other than a hero. The prerequisites were every inch a soldier and equal to any emergency. They dared to go where duty called, and knew by the crucial test of many an ensanguined field that their regiments would stand by them to the bitter end." And I think that's a pretty good summary of the service of Barksdale's brigade and the 21st Mississippi Infantry. And this July 2022 marks the 159th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. And some years ago I wrote an article about the 21st Mississippi's participation in that battle, and it was their bloodiest battle of the entire war in terms of total casualties. And I decided to really try and bring home the magnitude of this loss by listing the men in the regiment who were killed in the Battle of Gettysburg. And I've gone through that list and just picked out a few notable stories, like one or two men from each company of the regiment, just to put some names and faces and give you some real life stories of men from Mississippi that fought in the Battle of Gettysburg. I really hope it kind of brings them to life. These are more than just, casualty figures on a list. These were real men with real hopes and dreams, and for many of them, those hopes and dreams ended at Gettysburg. So I've broken the casualties down by company. The first company is Company A, the Volunteer Southrons, that were organized in Vicksburg, Warren County, Mississippi. And the soldier in question from Company A that I'm going to be talking about is Sergeant John Marshall Collier, who was age 27 at the time he was wounded. He was hit on July 2nd, 1863. He survived his Gettysburg wound and returned to the 21st Mississippi, serving until the very nearly the end of the war. He was captured at Harper's Farm, Virginia on April 6, 1865, but he lived to a ripe old age, dying in Vicksburg in 1898. In his obituary, his old wartime comrade, Roswell Valentine Booth, said of him, "In all the relations of life he was a most exemplary man, but that characteristic which seemed to me the most dominant in his nature was his deep sense of duty, an honest and earnest desire to truly perform all the obligations which devolved upon him, wherever he might be or by whatever circumstances surrounded." And I think that's a pretty good obituary. Another member of the Volunteer Southrons who was a casualty at Gettysburg was Second Lieutenant Walter W. Wolcott. And some of the men in the 21st Mississippi were northern born and literally had to break with their families when they decided to fight for the South. A good example is Lieutenant Wolcott, who was born in Starkey, New York. And I found the following passage about him in a history of Yates County, New York. And it said, "Walter Wolcott, Jr., the third son of Dr. Wolcott, was born in Starkey in 1827. He was educated at the common schools and at Starkey Seminary, and was afterwards a bookkeeper in Rochester, New York, St. Louis, Missouri, and in Rodney and Vicksburg, Mississippi. At the outbreak of the war, he enlisted in the rebel army and held the rank of lieutenant in the Vicksburg Volunteer Southrons. In Longstreet's terrible charge at Gettysburg, he was slain. All accounts describe him as a brave man, leading his men with undaunted courage on that bloody field. He was remarkable as a mathematical student and as an accomplished violin player." And after the war, Wolcott's father did have his body disinterred from Gettysburg and brought back to New York, and he rests today in Hillside Cemetery in Dundee, New York. Probably one of the very few Confederate tombstones in the state of New York. Now, the next man that I'm going to talk about is Private Elias B. GOLMON of Company C, the Stevens Rifles. And you might think to yourself, hey, you skipped Company B. Yes, I did, and there's a very good reason for that. Company B was transferred to the 48th Mississippi Infantry in early 1862 to help them round out their numbers and increase from a battalion up to regimental size. So the 21st Mississippi Infantry did not have a Company B at the Battle of Gettysburg, but they did have a Company C, the Stevens Rifles. And one of the casualties in that company was Private Elias B. GOLMON, who was 19 years old. He was wounded in the head on July 2nd, 1863. And during the Civil War, it was very common for kinfolk to fight side by side in the same regiment. It certainly happened quite a number of times in the 21st Mississippi Infantry. And a good example here is Private GOLMON. He and his brother, Corporal Henry Ithamer GOLMON, were both wounded in the fierce fighting at the Peach Orchard. These two brothers were very lucky. They both survived their wounds. They had two other brothers that were not as fortunate. Their brother John Harrison GOLMON died of congestive fever in 1861 while serving in the 18th Mississippi Infantry, which was also part of Barksdale's brigade. And Josiah GOLMON, who was a member of the 12th Mississippi Infantry, who was killed in 1862 at the Battle of Seven Pines. So it's very common to have family members serving together, and that's why in some of these big battles, families could be hard hit because they could have multiple family members killed or wounded in the same battle since they were serving together. It was a danger that they regularly faced. Now, another casualty in the Stevens Rifles was Sergeant Daniel Madden, age 28. He was mortally wounded by being shot in the right side July 2nd, 1863. He was mortally wounded. He died on July 5th. And he was wounded in the fighting around the Trossel Farm at Gettysburg. The 21st Mississippi was heavily engaged at the Trossel Farm, capturing much of the 9th Massachusetts battery there, but suffering numerous casualties in the process. One of those was Sergeant Madden, who was mortally wounded. He was buried in a common grave at the Trossel Farm, put in the same grave with another casualty, Sergeant Benjamin Nabke of the 18th Mississippi Infantry. On August 3rd, 1872, both Madden and Nabke were disinterred and their bodies shipped to Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond for burial in Southern soil. And that was pretty common. A lot of the Confederate casualties at Gettysburg that were buried on the field were later disinterred and removed to either Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond or to family cemeteries back home. Most of them to a Hollywood Cemetery because a lot of families just couldn't afford to have their relatives brought all the way back to Mississippi. Okay, our next company is Company D, the Jeff Davis Guards, organized in Woodville, Wilkinson County. And as I said before, these big battles could really be dangerous for families with multiple members in the same unit. And a good example of this is in Company D. The brothers Lemuel and William Glass of Wilkinson County were both killed on July 2nd fighting in the peach orchard. William was 26 and Lemuel was 21. So both fairly young men, and unfortunately both lost their lives July 2nd at Gettysburg. Our next company is Company E, the Hurricane Rifles, also from Wilkinson County, organized at Woodville. And the casualty from Company E is Captain Isaac Davis Stamps. He was 32 years old and wounded in the bowels on July 2nd. Mortally wounded, he died the next day. And Isaac Davis Stamps was the nephew of President Jefferson Davis, and he was also son-in-law of Benjamin Humphreys, who would become commander of the 21st Mississippi after the death of William Barksdale at Gettysburg. But Isaac Davis Stamps' wife, Mary Humphrey Stamps, had made Isaac a promise that if he was killed during the war, she would have his body brought back to Mississippi for burial in their family graveyard. And using her political connections in Richmond, she was able to have the body of her husband sent to the Confederate capital under a flag of truce. From there, she loaded her husband's body onto a train and began the long journey to Mississippi. Near Montgomery, Alabama, the railroad track had been destroyed by a Union raid, so Mary hired a wagon and driver, and they drove her husband's body back to Wilkinson County to fulfill her promise. And in fact, in some of the accounts, it stated that Mary actually slept in the wagon next to her husband's coffin during the trip home. But she did fulfill her promise. She got Isaac back to the family plantation Rosemont in Wilkinson County, and that is where he is buried today, and he does have a marked grave because of his wife's devotion. And our next company is Company F, the Tallahatchie Rifles, organized at Charleston in Tallahatchie County. And the casualty from the Tallahatchie Rifles is Henry S. Boisclair, who was at 25 years old, and he was captured in Pennsylvania during the Gettysburg campaign, but managed to escape and make it back to the unit. And some of the men who fought at Gettysburg in the 21st Mississippi did receive some compensation in later years because of their suffering. Private Henry Beauclerc was awarded a pension by the state of Mississippi in 1906, and then some years later was admitted to the Veterans Home at Beauvoir on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and he died there at Beauvoir on March 3rd, 1909, and is buried in the Confederate cemetery there. And another casualty from the Tallahatchie Rifles was he was later captain. At the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, he was a lieutenant, but Henry Harper Simmons, who was wounded in action and captured on July 2nd. His wound to his leg was so bad that his leg had to be amputated, and despite that, he lived a very long life, dying in Texas at the age of 85 in 1923. In his obituary, it was said of him, "Captain Simmons was one of the first to respond to the call of the South, going out with Barksdale's Brigade, 21st Mississippi Infantry, Company F, Tallahatchie Rifles. He served with Lee and Longstreet in Virginia and Maryland, and was in all the battles this glorious brigade participated in, from Virginia to Gettysburg. At Gettysburg, in the second day's charge on the Peach Orchard Hill, leading his men of Company F under Colonel Humphreys, he fell and it was thought mortally wounded. He was captured by the Federal troops, imprisoned at Fort McHenry and Point Lookout, where he remained prisoner for 8 months, and being a cripple for life, having lost his left leg in battle." And Simmons is another case where he had a family member serving alongside him in his company. His brother, Corporal James Lawrence Simmons, was also captured on July 4th, 1863, when he volunteered to stay behind and help tend to all of the wounded in the regiment who were too badly injured to be moved. Simmons was a doctor by profession, so it makes sense that he would volunteer to stay behind, but I can't help but thinking that his decision was colored by the fact that his brother had been wounded as well. James Simmons was sent to Point Lookout prisoner of war camp and was released on exchange in February of 1865. And our next company is Company G, the Madison Guards, organized in Canton, Madison County. And the casualty from this company is Lieutenant CICERO W. Denman, age 23 at the time he enlisted. He was wounded slightly in the face, if any wound to the face could be considered slight, on July 2nd, 1863 at Gettysburg. Denman recovered from his wound and continued to serve with the 21st Mississippi until July 1864, when he received a medical discharge due to his bronchitis. And a note in his service record simply stated that he was, quote, "a good soldier." And our next company is Company H, the Warren Volunteers, organized at Bovina in Warren County. And our casualty is Private Robert W. Fox, age 19, who was wounded July 2nd, 1863, and had his left thumb amputated. And it was an unfortunate fact during the war that sometimes fathers and sons ended up on opposite sides of the conflict. And a good example here is Robert W. Fox. His father was James Angel Fox, an Episcopalian minister of decided Unionist sentiment in Vicksburg. There's a great story concerning Reverend Fox. In December 1863, Union occupation authorities in Vicksburg brought in Reverend Fox to make the traditional blessing of the United States and its president, Abraham Lincoln. When Fox gave this prayer at Christ Church in Vicksburg, several of the local ladies walked out in protest, leading them to be banished from the city of Vicksburg. And I can only imagine the kinds of talks that Robert and his father must have had after the war, because they were both devoted to a cause, and I'm sure they must have had some tense moments, but hopefully they were able to put those behind them after the war. Private Fox survived his Gettysburg wound, and despite having had a thumb amputated, he returned to the 21st Mississippi, and he was wounded for a second time at the Battle of Spotsylvania on May 8, 1864, and then he was wounded for a third time later that same year in September of 1864. So he was wounded 3 times during the course of the war, but managed to survive all 3 wounds and live out and make it to the end of the conflict without being killed. Now our next company is Company I, the Sunflower Guards, which were organized in Sunflower County. And our casualty with the Sunflower Guards is Captain Tully Stuart Gibson, age 30, who was wounded in the thigh July 2nd, 1863. And some of the men who fought at Gettysburg were able to put the war behind them after the conflict ended. Dr. Tully S. Gibson was not one of those men. On May 7th, 1865, just after he arrived back home at the end of the war, he wrote to his former commander, Benjamin Humphreys, and he shared his thoughts on the end of the war. And he said, "Yours of the 5th instant was received this morning, confirming what I had already heard of the sadly humiliating condition of the country. I find but little comfort in the conviction that we were right and that I did my best. My opinion is that it is better to have fought and lost than never to have fought at all. Barnes, Dave, and Ben," and I think he's talking about their sons, "with their contemporaries will renew the struggle, and I trust succeed if we do not in our day. I am anxious to get into a country where Yankees cannot ride about in peace, comfort, and safety." And I have to say, Dr. Gibson was as good as his word. He gave the Yankees plenty of trouble in the Reconstruction efforts after the war. He was involved in Reconstruction riots that took place in Sunflower County. And on January 1st, 1870, the deputy sheriff of Sunflower County, J.J. Gainey, along with a group of soldiers from the 16th United States Infantry, attempted to arrest Dr. Gibson at his home. The good doctor refused to submit, and in the ensuing gun battle, Dr. Gibson was killed. In his obituary, it was said of Tully Gibson, "He was with the regiment at Yorktown, at Seven Pines, at Chickahominy, at Malvern Hill, at Harper's Ferry, at Sharpsburg, at 1st and 2nd Fredericksburg, and at Gettysburg, where he was disabled for life. He never missed a march or a duty that his company was called upon to perform, and although he may at any time have been appointed surgeon and have been detailed for hospital duties, he preferred to share the hardships and dangers of those he had gone to Virginia with from his beloved and native Mississippi." And our next company is Company K, the New Albany Grays, organized at New Albany in what was then Pontotoc County, what is today modern Union County. And our casualty is Lieutenant Theodore B. Sloan, age 31, who was wounded in the right lung on July 2nd, 1863, and captured in the hospital on July 3rd. And just 2 months after Lieutenant Sloan was wounded, his older brother, Captain John Newton Sloan, was wounded at the Battle of Chickamauga while leading the Mississippi Volunteers, Company G of the 45th Mississippi Infantry. And fortunately, both brothers recovered from their wounds. Theodore lived until 1917, and his brother John lived until 1897, even though he had suffered a horribly disfiguring wound to the face that had basically removed his lower jaw. And it was an amazing triumph of will that Captain Sloan survived at all, and much less was able to live out a relatively normal life until his death in 1897. But you see that a lot. Family members serving in more than one unit, and family members having to worry about one son fighting in Virginia, another fighting in the Western Theater in Tennessee and Georgia. And unfortunately for the Sloan family, they had casualties from 2 of their sons. And our last company is Company L, the Vicksburg Confederates, organized at Vicksburg, Warren County. And our casualty from the Vicksburg Confederates is Sergeant William Henderson, who was killed July 2nd, 1863 by an artillery shell. And Civil War artillery was great battlefield killer during the Civil War. And nothing illustrates this more than the note that accompanied Henderson's service record. It noted that he was, quote, struck by the same shell that hit Lieutenant Simmons and James Worley. And the Lieutenant Simmons is the Henry Simmons that we talked about earlier. The James Worley was a private in the 21st Mississippi. That one shell killed 2 men and wounded and maimed another for life. So you should not discount the killing power of Civil War artillery. Used properly, it can be extremely deadly. And the men I talked about in this episode are just a few of the casualties of the 21st Mississippi that they suffered at Gettysburg. Out of the approximately 400 men that the regiment took into the battle, it had 32 killed and 106 wounded. And the 21st Mississippi fought in about a dozen major battles in the war. For each one of those battles, there would have been a list just like this one for Gettysburg. There would have been family members back at home waiting impatiently for the casualty list to come out for each one of those battles, worrying that they were going to see the name of a family member in that list. And I could only imagine just the turmoil that must have existed in those families after they had heard that a big battle had taken place, and that they knew that their relative was probably in it, but they had no idea if they were alive, dead, wounded, in a hospital. It must have just been hell for the people back home. And I think that's a good segue for bringing up our next episode, which will be civilians during the Civil War. And again, I'm sorry that it had to be delayed, but it was unavoidable. But it will be coming very shortly. I'm going to try and get that out in the next few days. And thank you for watching this impromptu episode on the 21st Mississippi. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a like and a thumbs up. And I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.